In a small New England library, a 68-year-old retired librarian was about to face the ultimate test of family loyalty. What started as organizing books for a charity fundraiser took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a massive heart attack that would shatter everything she believed about love. Margaret Whitmore wasn't your typical small-town retiree. For 40 years, she had spent her life shepherding knowledge through Millbrook's library halls, known for her unwavering dedication to family and community above all else. When she encountered crushing chest pain while arranging leather-bound classics, she had no idea she was walking into a betrayal that would cut deeper than any physical wound. Margaret survived the cardiac emergency that would lead to the most devastating choice a mother could make. What began as a medical crisis would become a silent war of wills. The quiet streets of Millbrook would never be the same after a daughter chose celebration over comfort, and a mother chose revenge over forgiveness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Millbrook Public Library, casting golden rectangles across the polished hardwood floors. Margaret Whitmore moved between the book displays with practiced efficiency, her silver hair catching the autumn sun as she arranged volumes for the annual literacy fundraiser. At 68, she still carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years shepherding knowledge through these halls. The complete works of Dickens should go on the featured table, she murmured to herself, lifting a leather-bound set with reverent hands. The familiar weight of books had always comforted her. Their permanence, their ability to outlast the people who wrote them, read them, loved them. She'd started early this morning, arriving before the volunteers, wanting everything perfect for tomorrow's event. The fundraiser had been her idea 5 years ago, after Robert's death, when she'd needed something to fill the echoing spaces grief had carved in her daily routine. Now it raised nearly $10,000 annually for the Literacy Foundation. Money that bought books for low-income families, funded reading programs, kept the written word alive in ways that mattered. Margaret paused, pressing her palm against her chest. A strange tightness had been building there for the past hour, a pressure she'd attributed to stress. The fundraiser always made her anxious, despite its consistent success. She wanted it, to honor Robert's memory, to reflect the values they'd shared during their 40 years together. The pain intensified suddenly, radiating down her left arm with shocking violence. Margaret's breath caught. The Dickens collection slipped from her hands, volumes scattering across the floor with hollow thuds that echoed through the empty library. She reached for the circulation desk, her vision blurring at the edges. This wasn't stress. This was something else entirely, something that made her legs buckle and sent her crashing to her knees among the scattered books. "Help!" she whispered, but no one was there to hear. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked relentlessly as Margaret fought to breathe, each inhale feeling like broken glass in her chest. She fumbled for her cell phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I think I'm having a heart attack, Margaret gasped. Millbrook Library, please. The next 30 minutes blurred together, paramedics flooding through the doors she'd unlocked so carefully that morning, their equipment transforming her sanctuary into a medical scene. They worked with calm efficiency, asking questions she struggled to answer through the crushing pain. "Ma'am, do you have family we should contact?" "My daughter," Margaret managed. Emily Chen, Boston." Emily Whitmore Chen was reviewing campaign metrics for a client's product launch when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, Millbrook General Hospital, and felt her stomach drop. "Is this Emily Chen, daughter of Margaret Whitmore?" "Yes. What's wrong? Is she—" "Ms. Chen, your mother has suffered a heart attack. She's being treated in our emergency department. We need you to come as soon as possible." The words hit Emily like physical blows. Heart attack. Her mother, who walked 3 miles every morning, who gardened with the vigor of someone half her age, who'd never had so much as high blood pressure. How bad? Emily's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. She's stable for now, but you should come. Emily was already reaching for her car keys. I'm leaving Boston now. Tell her. Tell her I'm coming. The drive from Boston to Millbrook usually took 2 hours. Emily made it in 90 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she fought down panic. Her mother had always seemed invincible, the woman who'd held their family together after her father's death, who'd built a new life from the ruins of widowhood with determination and grace. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear. Emily found her mother in the cardiac care unit, pale and diminished against the white sheets, wires, and tubes connecting her to machines that beeped with mechanical rhythm. Mom? Emily touched her mother's hand gently. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly. Emily? You came. Of course I came. Emily pulled a chair close to the bed, tears she'd held back during the drive finally spilling over. How are you feeling? Like someone dropped a building on my chest. Margaret managed a weak smile. But better now that you're here. Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and the sort of steady presence that belonged in crisis situations. He introduced himself and gestured for Emily to join him in the hallway. Your mother suffered what we call a STEMI, a severe heart attack caused by a complete blockage in one of her major arteries. We performed an emergency cardiac catheterization and inserted a stent, which has restored blood flow. Emily absorbed this information, her mind working to process the medical terminology. Is she going to be okay? The immediate crisis has passed, but recovery will be lengthy. She'll need careful monitoring, medication management, and significant lifestyle changes. Most importantly, she'll need emotional support. Heart attack patients often struggle with depression and anxiety during recovery. How long? Full. Recovery could take several months. The first few weeks are critical, not just medically but emotionally. Patients often feel vulnerable, fearful of another episode. Family support makes an enormous difference in both psychological and physical healing. Emily nodded, already mentally rearranging her schedule. I can stay for a while. Work can wait. That's good to hear. Your mother mentioned you live in Boston? Yes, but I can. I'll figure it out. Dr. Morrison's expression grew more serious. Ms. Chen, I want to be direct with you. Your mother's recovery isn't just about medical care. She's going to need to feel secure, loved, supported. The emotional component of cardiac recovery is as important as the physical therapy. Emily returned to her mother's bedside, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair that would be her home for the night. Margaret dozed fitfully, her breathing shallow but steady. Emily held her hand, studying the familiar lines and spots that mapped 70 years of life. Hands that had braided her hair, signed permission slips, applauded at school plays, comforted her through heartbreak. I should call David. Emily murmured when Margaret stirred. Let him know what's happening. Yes, of course. Margaret's voice was hoarse. And you should call Sarah, too. Isn't her wedding coming up soon? Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. Mom, don't worry about that right now. When is it again? I know you've been so excited. 3 weeks. The words felt heavy, loaded with implications Emily wasn't ready to examine. Margaret's eyes searched her daughter's face. 3 weeks. That's not much time. Mom, please, let's just focus on getting you better. But Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the ceiling tiles. Italy, wasn't it? Tuscany? Yes, but your college roommate, the one who helped you through, after your father died. Emily's throat tightened. Sarah's been planning this for 2 years, but that doesn't matter now. What matters is you. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand weakly. Don't make any rash decisions, sweetheart. I'm going to be fine." The words hung in the sterile air between them, carrying weight that neither woman was ready to acknowledge. Emily watched her mother's eyes drift closed again, and for the first time since receiving the phone call, she allowed herself to think about what the next few weeks would bring. Outside, the October night settled over Millbrook like a blanket, and in the distance, church bells marked the passing hours. Emily pulled the thin hospital blanket around her shoulders and prepared for a long night of watching her mother breathe, of counting heartbeats on the monitor, of beginning to understand that some choices would define them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The machines beeped steadily in the darkness, marking time until morning would bring new decisions, new complications, and the first real test of what love looked like when it collided with the messy realities of life. 3 days later, the ambulance pulled away from Margaret's Victorian house on Elm Street, leaving behind a woman who looked smaller somehow in her own living room. Emily had spent those hospital days learning a new vocabulary: ejection fraction, beta blockers, cardiac rehabilitation, words that had become the framework of her mother's new reality. The house overflowed with evidence of community care. Flowers crowded every surface: roses from the garden club, lilies from the book discussion, group, cheerful daisies from Margaret's former colleagues at the library. Cards lined the mantelpiece like colorful sentries, each one a reminder of the life Margaret had built in Millbrook, the networks of friendship and service that defined small-town existence. "Mrs. Patterson from next door brought a casserole," Emily said, reading from a note tied to a covered dish. "And the Methodist Women's Circle organized a meal train for the next 2 weeks." Margaret settled carefully into her favorite armchair, the one positioned to catch morning light through the bay window. "People are too kind," she murmured, though Emily caught the tremor in her voice, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming reality of being cared for instead of caring for others. A knock at the door interrupted the afternoon quiet. Emily opened it to find a woman in her 40s wearing scrubs and carrying a medical bag. Her smile was professional, but warm, the kind earned through years of walking into strangers' homes during their most vulnerable moments. "I'm Pat Kelly from Millbrook Home Care. Dr. Morrison arranged for me to help with your mother's recovery." Emily shook her hand gratefully. "Thank God. I wasn't sure how to manage all the medication schedules and monitoring." Pat's assessment was thorough but gentle, checking Margaret's blood pressure, reviewing pill organizers, explaining warning signs to watch for. Emily took careful notes, filling a small notebook with instructions that felt like a foreign language. "The good news is your mother's recovery is progressing well," Pat told them both. "With proper medication compliance and gradual activity increases, there's no reason she can't return to most of her normal activities within a few months." Margaret nodded, but Emily noticed how her mother's hands gripped the chair arms. "What? About being alone? Is it safe for her to be by herself?" "For short periods, yes, but I'd recommend having someone check in daily, at least for the first few weeks. Family support makes an enormous difference in recovery outcomes." The words hung in the air like an unspoken question. Emily felt the weight of implication, though Pat's professional tone revealed nothing. After Pat left, mother and daughter sat in careful silence, surrounded by flowers that made the living room feel like a wake for Margaret's former independence. Emily scrolled through her phone, mentally calculating how much time she could reasonably take from work. How long David could manage alone in Boston. "You don't have to hover, sweetheart," Margaret said finally. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know, but Dr. Morrison said—" "Dr. Morrison doesn't understand that I raised you by myself after your father died. I managed then, and I can manage now." The reference to Robert's death settled between them like dust in sunlight, visible, stirring, impossible to ignore. Emily remembered those awful months when her mother had tried to be everything: grieving widow, single parent, breadwinner. Margaret had been 38 then, Emily only 14. Different circumstances, but the same stubborn independence that now seemed more fragile than admirable. David's arrival that evening brought a different energy to the house. He hugged Emily tightly, kissed Margaret's cheek with careful formality, and began the delicate dance of being a son-in-law who'd never quite found his footing with his wife's mother. "How are you feeling, Margaret?" he asked, settling on the couch with the careful posture of someone aware he didn't entirely belong. "Better every day. Emily's been wonderful, but I keep telling her she doesn't need to babysit me." David glanced at Emily, reading the tension in her posture. "Well, you know Emily. She worries." "She gets that from her father," Margaret said. And Emily caught the slight emphasis on the word, a reminder of genetic loyalties that predated marriage. Later, as Emily helped Margaret prepare for bed, her mother's vulnerability showed through the cracks in her daytime composure. "I hate this," Margaret whispered as Emily organized her nighttime medications. "Being dependent, having people worry." "It's temporary, Mom. Pat said you're recovering well. Your father used to say that dependency was just another word for love." Margaret's voice grew distant. "When he was sick, I wanted to take care of him. It felt like the most natural thing in the world." Emily felt the comparison like a physical weight. Her father's cancer had been different, terminal, requiring the kind of total devotion that had an endpoint, a known conclusion. This felt more complicated, open-ended, a recovery that could stretch into an indefinite future of careful monitoring and gradual progress. Rose Patterson arrived the next morning with coffee cake and the kind of direct manner that belonged to women who'd buried husbands and raised children without apology. She was Margaret's age, but carried herself with the authority of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. "Emily, dear, you look tired," Rose observed, settling into the kitchen chair like she belonged there. "This is quite a responsibility for someone with a busy career in the city." "I'm managing fine," Emily replied, though she felt defensive without knowing why. "Of course you are. Your mother raised you right." Rose's smile held layers of meaning. "Though I imagine this timing is difficult, what with that wedding coming up." Margaret looked up from her coffee cup. "What wedding?" Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Sarah's wedding. My college roommate. It's in a few weeks." "In Italy, isn't it?" Rose's tone remained conversational, but Emily sensed judgment lurking beneath the pleasantries. "How lovely. For her. Though I suppose you'll be postponing your trip, given the circumstances." The assumption landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the comfortable morning routine. Emily found herself nodding before she could think. Yes, of course. Family comes first. But even as she said it, she felt something. Inside her rebel. Sarah had been her closest friend through college, had held her together during her father's final months, had been the sister she'd never had. And Emily was supposed to be maid of honor. Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral. "You shouldn't make hasty decisions, Emily. I'm going to be fine." "Mother's intuition," Rose said with approval. "Though naturally a daughter's place is with her family during times like these. That's what family means. Being there when it matters most." After Rose left, the house felt smaller somehow, charged with unspoken expectations. Emily found David in the backyard, ostensibly checking the garden, but really escaping the feminine tension that had filled the kitchen. "We need to talk," Emily said. They walked to the end of the garden, where Margaret's prized roses were beginning their autumn dormancy. David listened as Emily explained the wedding situation, the pressure she felt, the guilt that gnawed at her whenever she thought about Sarah waiting for her response. "What does your mother want?" David asked. "She won't say. She just keeps insisting she'll be fine, but then she makes these comments about family loyalty and how she was there for me when Dad died." David was quiet for a moment, and Emily recognized his thinking face, the careful processing that had made him successful in software development and frustrating as a husband when she wanted immediate emotional responses. "In my family," he said finally, "this wouldn't be a question. You'd stay. End of discussion." "But this isn't your family." "No, but maybe that perspective helps. Your mother almost died, Emily. She's scared, even if she won't admit it. She needs to know you're choosing her." The word choosing hit Emily hard. "It's not about choosing. Sarah's my best friend. She was there for me. And now your mother needs you to be there for her." Emily felt tears of frustration building. "So I'm supposed to disappoint Sarah? Miss her wedding she's been planning? This for 2 years. You're supposed to do what feels right. But don't pretend this is an easy choice with no consequences either way." Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret calling from the house, her voice carrying that particular note of need that never failed to bring Emily running. As they walked back, Emily caught her mother watching them through the kitchen window, her expression unreadable, but somehow knowing. That evening, Sarah called while Emily was doing dishes, and Margaret dozed in her chair. Emily stepped into the dining room for privacy, but the old house carried sound in unexpected ways. "Em, I've been trying to reach you for days. Mom said, you had some family emergency?" Sarah's voice bubbled with excitement and concern in equal measure. Emily found herself explaining about the heart attack, the recovery, the complicated logistics of care and distance. "Oh my God, Emily, that's terrifying. How is she doing? Are you okay?" She's going to be fine. It's just going to take time." "But you're still coming, right? I mean, I know it's complicated, but the wedding is only 2 weeks away. I need my maid of honor." Emily glanced toward the living room, where Margaret appeared to be sleeping but might very well be listening. "I don't know, Sarah. It's complicated. Emily, I get that this is scary, but she's out of the hospital, right? She has medical care? I can't imagine getting married without you there. You're the closest thing I have to a sister." The words cut deep because they were true. Sarah had no siblings, parents who cared more about social status than emotional support. Emily had been her anchor through college heartbreaks, career changes, and now this wedding to a man who adored her completely. "Let me think about it," Emily said finally. "I need to see how Mom does over the next few days." "Of course, just please try. This is my one and only wedding, you know?" After Sarah hung up, Emily stood in the dining room, staring at the photos that lined Margaret's mantelpiece. 40 years of family history, pictures of Robert, of Emily's childhood, of graduations and holidays, and ordinary moments that had seemed permanent until they weren't. She returned to the living room to find Margaret's eyes open, watching her with the sharp attention that meant she'd heard enough to understand. "That was Sarah," Emily said unnecessarily. "I figured." Margaret's voice was carefully neutral. She must be excited about the wedding. "Yes." Emily sat down, feeling the weight of decision pressing against her chest. "Mom, I need to ask you something directly. Do you want me to stay? Do you need me here?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Emily thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, almost childlike. "I want what's best for you, sweetheart. I always have." It wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. But it was all Margaret could bring herself to say, and Emily realized that some decisions would have to be made without the clarity she craved. The space between them filled with unspoken needs and careful politeness, and Emily understood that whatever choice she made would define something fundamental about who they were to each other. Outside, the October wind rustled through the maple trees, and Emily felt the weight of love and obligation settling around her shoulders, like a coat she wasn't sure she wanted to wear. 2 weeks into Margaret's recovery, the rhythm of care had settled into something resembling normalcy. Emily had extended her leave from work, explaining to her manager that family emergencies couldn't be scheduled around quarterly reports. Pat Kelly visited daily, monitoring Margaret's progress with professional efficiency, and the steady stream of neighbors bearing casseroles had slowed to a manageable trickle. But beneath the surface calm, tension coiled like a spring wound too tight. The wedding was now only 1 week away, and Emily found herself caught between Sarah's increasingly frequent calls and her mother's carefully orchestrated displays of fragility. Margaret had mastered the art of the meaningful pause, stopping, mid-sentence when climbing stairs, pressing her hand to her chest with theatrical concern, mentioning offhandedly how the nights seemed so much longer now. She never directly asked Emily to stay, but her unspoken expectations filled the house like expensive perfume, impossible to ignore. "Your color looks much better today," Emily observed over breakfast, trying to inject optimism into the morning routine. "Dr. Morrison says the new medication is helping." Margaret stirred her oatmeal slowly, as if the simple action required careful concentration. Though he did mention that stress can trigger another episode. Apparently, feeling abandoned is a significant risk factor for cardiac patients. Emily's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "Mom, you're not abandoned. Pat comes every day, Rose checks on you constantly, and I've arranged for, I know, sweetheart. You've been wonderfully thorough." Margaret's smile was brittle around the edges. "I just worry about being alone at night. What if something happens? What if I can't reach the phone?" The fear in her mother's voice was real, even if Emily suspected it was being weaponized. Since Robert's death, Margaret had lived alone in this house for 5 years, had prided herself on independence, had often remarked that she preferred the quiet. Now that self-sufficiency had become another casualty of the heart attack, leaving behind a woman who seemed to shrink a little more each day. Pat Kelly arrived for the morning visit, bringing with her the reassuring competence that Emily had come to depend on. After checking Margaret's vital signs and reviewing medications, Pat asked to speak with Emily privately. "How's she really doing?" Emily asked as they stepped onto the front porch. "Physically, she's making excellent progress. Her heart function is stabilizing, she's tolerating the medications well, and her energy is returning gradually." Pat's expression grew more serious. "Emotionally is another story. The depression Dr. Morrison mentioned? It's common after cardiac events. But I'm seeing something else here, a level of emotional dependency that concerns me. Your mother is a strong woman who's built her identity around taking care of others. Now she needs care herself, and that's triggering some complicated responses." Emily felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. "What kind of responses?" "She's becoming overly focused on your presence as a security blanket. That's normal to some extent, but I worry she's not developing the confidence she needs for true recovery." Pat chose her words carefully. "Has she expressed specific concerns about you leaving town?" "She hasn't said anything directly, but, Emily trailed off, unsure how to explain the subtle pressure campaign her mother had been waging. "Emily, I'm going to be frank with you. Your mother doesn't need 24-hour supervision. She's not at risk for sudden cardiac death. Her medications are stable, and she has excellent support systems in place. What she needs is to rebuild confidence in her ability to live independently." The words hit Emily like cold water. "So if I went away for a few days, it might actually be beneficial. Forced independence, with proper safety nets in place." Pat's smile was gentle but firm. Sometimes the best way to help someone heal is to show them they're stronger than they think. That afternoon, Rose Patterson arrived with her usual combination of good intentions and sharp observations. She settled into Margaret's kitchen as if it were her own, arranging cookies on a plate with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing social rituals for 7 decades. "How are you feeling today, dear?" Rose asked Margaret, though her eyes tracked Emily's movements around the kitchen. "Better, I think, though the nights are still difficult. I imagine they would be. All that quiet time to think about mortality, about what matters most." Rose's tone was conversational, but Emily recognized the leading quality of her words. Pat Kelly thinks Mom's recovery is going very well, Emily interjected. Oh, nurses always focus on the medical side of things, Rose said dismissively. They don't understand what it means to have your only child so far away when you're facing your own fragility. Margaret's hand went to her chest, not the theatrical gesture Emily had grown accustomed to, but an unconscious movement that spoke of genuine vulnerability. I just want Emily to be happy. I've always wanted that. Of course you do, but happiness isn't just about chasing after distant friendships, is it? It's about honoring the people who've loved you your whole life. Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. Rose, Sarah isn't a distant friendship. She's a lovely girl, I'm sure. But Emily, dear, you only get one mother. Wedding invitations are just pieces of paper, but family is forever. The conversation was interrupted by Emily's phone ringing. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Emily felt her heart rate spike. She excused herself and stepped into the dining room, though she knew every word would carry back to the kitchen. Em, please tell me you have good news. Sarah's voice was strained. The caterer needs final numbers, and I still don't know if my maid of honor is coming. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decision pressing against her temples. Sarah, I'm so sorry this is taking so long. Mom's recovery is it's complicated. I get that it's scary, but Emily, she's stable, right? She has professional care. I need to know if I should ask my cousin to step in as maid of honor. The words stung more than Emily expected. Your cousin? I don't want to, Em. You know I don't. But Tom's family is flying in from Ireland. And if you're not coming, I need to figure out the ceremony logistics. Please, just tell me honestly, are you coming or not? Emily glanced toward the kitchen, where she could hear Margaret and Rose discussing meal preparations for the week ahead. Her mother's voice sounded stronger than it had in days, more like her old self. Pat's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the best way to help someone heal is to show them they're stronger than they think. I'm coming, Emily said, the decision surprising her even as she spoke it. I'll be there, Sarah, I promise. The relief in Sarah's voice was palpable. Oh my God, thank you. I was starting to panic. When do you fly out? Friday. The word came out before Emily had consciously planned it. I'll fly out Friday and be back the following Tuesday. 5 days in Tuscany with your best friend. It'll be perfect. After hanging up, Emily remained in the dining room, staring at the family photos that chronicled decades of Whitmore history. She'd made her choice, but she could already feel its weight settling over her like storm clouds. She returned to the kitchen to find Margaret and Rose deep in conversation about church potluck planning, discussing it with the kind of animated engagement that Margaret hadn't shown since before the heart attack. The irony wasn't lost on Emily. Her mother seemed more vital when focusing on caring for others than when dwelling on her own recovery. Mom, I need to talk to you about something. Margaret looked up, and Emily caught something shift in her expression, a flicker of knowledge, as if she'd been expecting this conversation. I've decided to go to Sarah's wedding. I'll leave Friday and be back Tuesday. Pat thinks a few days of independence might actually be good for your recovery, and Rose will check on you daily. The silence that followed felt like held breath. Margaret's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, hurt, disappointment, and finally, a careful mask of understanding. Of course, sweetheart. I wouldn't want you to miss something so important. But Emily saw her mother's hands tremble slightly as she reached for her teacup, saw the way Margaret's eyes went distant and wounded. Rose's expression was frankly disapproving, her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke volumes about family duty and modern selfishness. Are you sure you're okay with this? Emily asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted the honest answer. I'm sure. Margaret's voice was steady, controlled. You've sacrificed enough for me already. Go. Enjoy your friend's wedding. I'll be fine. The words were gracious, exactly what Emily had hoped to hear. So why did they feel like a door closing, like something fundamental shifting between them? Why did her mother's blessing sound so much like goodbye? That evening, Emily began making arrangements, booking flights, coordinating with Pat for extended coverage, creating detailed care instructions for Rose and the neighbors. The logistics of leaving felt both practical and like an elaborate betrayal, each detail another step away from the woman who had raised her, loved her, needed her. Margaret watched these preparations with the careful attention of someone memorizing details for later examination. She said nothing about Emily's choice, offered no guilt or manipulation, but her silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. As Emily fell asleep that night, she wondered if she was making the right decision or the first in a series of choices that would define the rest of their relationship. Outside, the October wind carried the scent of dying leaves, and somewhere, in the darkness, her mother lay awake, counting heartbeats, and reconsidering what love looked like when it wasn't reciprocated in the ways she'd expected. Margaret sat in her living room Friday evening, listening to the silence that had settled over the house like dust. Emily's departure that morning had been efficient. A quick goodbye, promises to call daily, and instructions for Pat Kelly that read like a military deployment manual. The space Emily had occupied for 2 weeks now felt cavernous, filled with the absence of someone who had chosen celebration over caretaking. Pat had stayed later than usual, clearly uncomfortable leaving Margaret alone for the first extended period since the heart attack. "Are you certain you're comfortable with this arrangement?" she'd asked for the third time. "I'm fine," Margaret had replied, though the word felt foreign on her tongue. Fine. When had she ever been merely fine? She'd been competent, capable, needed. Now she was fine, which seemed like another word for forgotten. The evening stretched ahead with the particular weight of solitude that felt different from chosen alone time. This was abandonment disguised as independence, and Margaret found herself cataloging every sound, the house settling, the refrigerator humming, her own heartbeat that still seemed too fragile, too unreliable. She picked up her phone twice to call Emily, then set it down both times. What would she say? That the silence felt like judgment? That every hour of Emily's absence felt like confirmation that she'd been wrong about what mattered most to her? Daughter? 5,000 miles away, Emily stood on the terrace of a 13th-century villa, watching the Tuscan sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and amber. The beauty was overwhelming, exactly what Sarah had promised when she'd chosen this location 2 years ago. But Emily found herself checking her phone compulsively, waiting for messages that didn't come. "You've looked at that thing 12 times in the last hour," David observed, joining her at the stone railing. He'd arrived that afternoon, his presence a relief Emily hadn't expected to need. "I just want to make sure Mom's okay." "She's okay. Pat would call if there were any problems." Emily nodded, but the guilt sat heavy in her chest like undigested food. "I keep thinking about her sitting alone in that house, wondering if I made the right choice." "You made the only choice you could live with," David said gently. "Sarah needed you here. And Mom needed me there. Maybe, or maybe your mother needed to prove to herself that she could survive without you hovering." Pat seemed to think independence would be good for her recovery. Emily wanted to believe that, but she couldn't shake the image of Margaret's face when she'd announced her decision, the careful mask of understanding that hadn't quite hidden the hurt underneath. Sarah appeared beside them, radiant in the particular way of brides the night before their wedding. "Em, there you are. Come inside. We're doing the final rehearsal for tomorrow's ceremony." Emily followed her friend inside, forcing herself to focus on flower arrangements and processional timing, pushing down the voice that whispered she was 5,000 miles away from where she belonged. Saturday morning brought a parade of well-meaning visitors to Margaret's door. Rose arrived first with homemade muffins and the particular brand of concern that felt more like surveillance. "How was your first night alone, dear?" "Peaceful," Margaret lied, omitting the 3 times she'd woken with chest pains that turned out to be anxiety, not cardiac distress. Mrs. Henderson from the Methodist Church stopped by with flowers from the altar. Such a shame Emily couldn't postpone her trip. "In my day, family came first." Margaret smiled tightly. Emily has her own life to live. But each visitor's assumption that Emily should have stayed, that family duty trumped everything else, felt like salt in a wound Margaret was trying to pretend didn't exist. By afternoon, she'd stopped answering the door entirely, letting the phone ring while she sat in Robert's old chair, staring at the wedding photo on the mantelpiece. Her phone rang again. Pat Kelly's number. "Just checking in, Margaret. How are you feeling today?" "I'm fine." The word again, that careful construction of normalcy. Any chest pain? Shortness of breath? Dizziness? "No, nothing like that." Pat's silence suggested she heard something in Margaret's tone. "Are you feeling sad? That's normal after a cardiac event, especially when your support system changes. Suddenly." Support system. As if Emily were just another medical intervention, interchangeable with pills and monitoring equipment. "I'm managing perfectly well," Margaret said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. She was managing. Which meant Emily's constant presence hadn't been medically necessary. It had been emotionally desired. The distinction felt crucial and devastating. The wedding ceremony took place in a small chapel overlooking the valley, with afternoon light streaming through ancient stained glass. Sarah was luminous, Tom couldn't stop smiling, and Emily stood beside her best friend trying to be present for a moment she'd anticipated for months. But when the priest spoke about love and commitment, about being there through sickness and health, Emily's mind wandered to a hospital room where she'd held her mother's hand through the night. When Sarah repeated her vows about forsaking all, others for the love of her life, Emily thought about choosing friendship over family, and wondered what that said about her own capacity for loyalty. David reached for her hand during the ceremony, squeezing gently when he noticed tears on her cheeks. She wasn't sure if she was crying for Sarah's happiness or her own complicated grief. The reception was held in the villa's gardens, with twinkling lights strung between olive trees and tables laden with local delicacies. Emily went through the motions of celebration, toasting the couple, dancing with David, laughing at speeches, but she felt like she was watching herself from a distance, performing the role of the devoted friend while her heart remained tethered to a small New England town. "You did the right thing," Sarah whispered during their maid of honor dance. "I know this was hard, but I needed you here. You're the closest thing I have to family." The words should have been comforting, but they felt like an accusation. Emily had chosen to be Sarah's family and abandoned her actual family in the process. Sunday evening found Margaret sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the business card attorney William Hayes had given her years ago when they'd updated Robert's will. The house felt different now, not like a home, waiting for its inhabitants to return, but like a mausoleum for relationships that had died without proper burial. She'd spent the weekend parsing the visits from neighbors, the careful way they'd asked about Emily, the assumptions they'd made about family loyalty. Each conversation had been a small knife twist, confirmation that her own community viewed her daughter's choice as abandonment. But more than the neighbors' judgment, it was the realization of her own dispensability that had hardened something inside Margaret's chest. Pat Kelly was right. She didn't need constant supervision. Her recovery was progressing well. Emily's presence had been emotional comfort, not medical necessity, which meant Emily had chosen a party over providing comfort to her own mother. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Hayes's number before she could reconsider. "William? It's Margaret Whitmore. I know it's Sunday evening, but I need to schedule an appointment. There are some changes I need to make to my will." "Margaret, I hope this isn't a decision you're making while you're still recovering. Estate planning. Should be done with a clear head? My head has never been clearer, Margaret interrupted. How soon can we meet? Tuesday morning, if it's urgent. It's urgent. She hung up and sat in the growing darkness, feeling something settle inside her chest that wasn't quite peace, but wasn't pain either. It was resolution, cold, clear, and irreversible. Emily had made her choice. Now Margaret would make hers. Outside, the October night pressed against the windows, and somewhere in Tuscany, her daughter danced under fairy lights, unaware that love could curdle into something harder when it wasn't returned in the measure it was given. The house settled around Margaret like a judgment, and she began to understand that some betrayals couldn't be forgiven, only answered in kind. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of New England weather that seemed designed to match Margaret's mood. She dressed carefully for her appointment with William Hayes, her navy suit, the one she'd worn to Robert's funeral, the one that made her feel armored against the world's disappointments. Hayes's office occupied the second floor of a Victorian building on Main Street, its mahogany furniture and leather-bound law books speaking to decades of handling Millbrook's legal affairs. Margaret had been coming here for 20 years, first with Robert for their joint will, then alone after his death to settle the estate. She knew these rooms, trusted these walls to keep secrets. William Hayes rose from behind his desk as she entered, his expression already troubled. At 58, he'd handled enough family disputes to recognize the particular set of Margaret's shoulders, the careful control in her voice when she'd called. "Margaret, how are you feeling? I was sorry to hear about your heart attack." "Much better, thank you. Strong enough to handle my own affairs." She settled into the familiar leather chair across from his desk, the same one where she'd signed papers making Emily her sole heir 5 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. Hayes opened a legal pad, his pen poised but hesitant. "You mentioned wanting to make changes to your will. Before we begin, I want to ask, is this something you've thought through carefully? Major estate decisions shouldn't be made during times of stress or illness. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The conviction in her voice seemed to surprise them both. Margaret had spent the weekend replaying every conversation, every missed call, every moment when Emily had chosen something, anything, other than being present for her mother's recovery. The pattern was clear once she stopped making excuses for it. "What specifically did you want to change?" Margaret took a breath, feeling the weight of the words before she spoke them. "I want to remove Emily as my beneficiary entirely. Everything goes to the Millbrook Literacy Foundation instead." Hayes set down his pen, his expression shifting from professional concern to something approaching alarm. "Margaret, that's a significant change. Are you certain you want to disinherit your daughter completely?" "Completely." The word hung in the air between them, final and unforgiving. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret's face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading people's motivations. "Can you help me understand what's prompted this decision? When we last met, you spoke about Emily with such pride, such love." "I spoke about the daughter I thought I had raised. It turns out I was mistaken about her character." Margaret's voice remained steady, but Hayes caught the tremor of hurt underneath the anger. He'd seen this before, family relationships, destroyed by expectations, misunderstandings, pride on all sides. "Margaret, I've known your family for 2 decades. Emily has always struck me as a caring, responsible young woman. What's happened to change your mind so drastically?" The question opened a floodgate Margaret hadn't realized she'd been holding back. "She abandoned me, William. When I needed her most, when I was frightened and vulnerable and facing my own mortality, she chose to go to a party in Italy instead of staying with her mother." "The wedding," Hayes said quietly. "I heard about that from Rose Patterson." "Oh, I'm sure. Rose had plenty to say about it. The whole town knows my daughter prioritizes her social life over family duty. Hayes was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Margaret, forgive me for asking, but did Emily know you needed her to stay? Did you directly ask her not to go? The question hit like a physical blow. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger mixing with something that might have been shame. I shouldn't have had to ask. A daughter should know. She should have wanted to stay. But you didn't ask. No. The admission felt like pulling teeth. I told her to go. I said I wanted her to be happy. Hayes leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Margaret, I'm not a marriage counselor, but I've seen enough family conflicts to know that unspoken expectations are relationship poison. If you needed Emily to stay but told her to go, how was she supposed to know what you really wanted? Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. She should have known. Love means paying attention. It means choosing the people who matter most when it counts. Does Emily know how much her absence hurt you? She knows. How does she know? The question caught Margaret off guard. How did Emily know? From Margaret's carefully neutral responses to her daily calls? From her polite acceptance of Emily's decision? From her insistence that she was fine every time they spoke? It doesn't matter, Margaret said finally. What matters is that when I was at my most vulnerable, my only child chose a party over being with me. That tells me everything I need to know about her priorities. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying the legal pad in front of him. Margaret, I want you to consider something. Are you changing your will because you want to support the Literacy Foundation, or because you want to punish Emily? The directness of the question took Margaret's breath away. Both, she said finally. The foundation does important work. They'll use the money wisely. And Emily? Emily has made her choices. Now I'm making mine. Hayes sighed, recognizing the futility of further argument. He'd learned over the years that sometimes people needed to make their own mistakes, even legally binding ones. If you're determined to do this, I need to ask some standard questions. Are you under any duress? Taking any medications that might affect your judgment? Do you understand the permanent nature of this decision? I understand perfectly. My mind has never been clearer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret answered each question with the same steady conviction, watching Hayes draft the new will with mechanical precision. Each word on the page felt like a small revenge, a way to ensure that Emily would someday understand the consequences of putting friendship before family. There's a standard waiting period I recommend for major will changes, Hayes said as he printed the final document. 30 days to reconsider. Make sure this is really what you want. I don't need 30 days. I don't need 30 minutes. I want to sign it now. Margaret's signature felt different this time, not the careful penmanship of someone documenting love and legacy, but the sharp strokes of someone drawing a line in the sand. As she handed the pen back to Hayes, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness, like finishing a meal that had looked appealing but left her somehow still hungry. Margaret, Hayes said as she prepared to leave, I hope you'll consider talking to Emily directly about how you're feeling. Communication might heal this rift before it becomes permanent. Some things can't be healed, William. Some betrayals are too fundamental. She left his office feeling lighter somehow, as if she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying for weeks. The gray morning had brightened into something approaching sunshine, and Margaret walked home with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd taken action instead of simply enduring. 3,000 miles away, Emily stood in the villa's garden, watching Sarah dance with her new husband while Italian music drifted across the terrace. The wedding had been everything Sarah had dreamed, romantic, intimate, perfect in every detail that mattered. But Emily found herself checking her phone compulsively, guilt gnawing at her despite the beauty of the celebration. She'd called home twice already today, reaching only Pat Kelly both times. "Your mother seems fine," Pat had said during the afternoon call. "Maybe a little quiet, but her vital signs are stable. She had several visitors today." "Did she seem upset about anything?" Pat had paused, considering. "She seemed different somehow. More resolved, if that makes sense. But not medically concerning." Now, as Emily watched Sarah beam with happiness, she tried to push down the nagging sense that something important was happening back home, something she should be paying attention to. "Thank you," Sarah said, appearing beside her with flushed cheeks and sparkling eyes, "for being here despite everything with your mother. I know it wasn't an easy choice." Emily forced a smile. "Of course, I wouldn't have missed this. How is she doing? Your mom?" She's managing well. Better than I expected, actually." Sarah's expression grew concerned. It must have been terrifying. A heart attack is so serious. Emily realized suddenly that Sarah had no idea how serious Margaret's condition had been, how close they'd come to losing her entirely. In all their conversations about the wedding, Emily had downplayed the crisis, not wanting to burden her friend with guilt about the timing. "Yes," Emily said quietly. "It was terrifying." As the evening wore on, Emily participated in the celebration while part of her mind remained focused on a house 5,000 miles away, where her mother sat alone with whatever thoughts occupied, someone who'd just made an irreversible decision about love, loyalty, and the price of feeling abandoned. Neither woman understood yet that they'd both crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, that the distance between Tuscany and Millbrook was nothing compared to the emotional chasm that was opening between them with each passing hour. Emily's key turned in the front door of her mother's house with the familiar resistance that spoke of old locks and settled wood. She'd been gone only 5 days, but the house felt different somehow, quieter, more watchful, as if it had been holding its breath in her absence. "Mom? I'm back," she called, setting down her suitcase and the bag of carefully chosen Italian gifts. The silence that greeted her felt heavier than it should have, considering Margaret was expecting her return. Margaret appeared in the doorway, between the kitchen and living room, moving with more confidence than she'd shown since the heart attack. The improvement should have been encouraging, but something in her mother's posture, the careful distance she maintained, the polite smile, that didn't reach her eyes, made Emily's stomach tighten with unease. "How was your flight?" Margaret asked, the question carrying the formal tone reserved for acquaintances rather than family. "Long, but fine. How have you been? You look better, stronger." "I am stronger." Pat Kelly was right. A few days of independence did me good. The words stung more than they should have. Emily had hoped her mother might have missed her, might have realized how much she appreciated Emily's care and presence. Instead, Margaret seemed to be announcing that she'd been unnecessary all along. "I brought you some things from Italy," Emily said, forcing brightness into her voice as she opened the gift bag. "Olive oil from the villa where we stayed, and this beautiful scarf from a shop in the village." Margaret accepted the gifts with the same polite distance she might show a neighbor bringing cookies. "How thoughtful. Thank you." "And photos," Emily continued, pulling out her phone with the desperate energy of someone trying to bridge a widening gap. "The ceremony was beautiful. Sarah looked radiant. I thought you might want to see—" "I'm sure it was lovely," Margaret interrupted gently but firmly. "Perhaps another time. I'm still tiring easily." Emily felt the dismissal like a physical blow. Her mother had always been interested in Emily's life, had wanted details about trips and friends and experiences. This indifference felt calculated, designed to hurt. "Mom, are you angry with me about going to the wedding?" Margaret settled into her chair with careful movements, arranging herself like someone posing for a portrait. "Of course not, sweetheart. You had to make a choice, and you made it. I understand your priorities perfectly now." The words were gracious on the surface, but Emily heard the ice underneath. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not angry. Anger implies surprise, and I wasn't surprised by your decision. It was entirely consistent with who you are." Emily sat on the couch, feeling like she was navigating a conversation in a foreign language. "Who I am? Someone who puts her own desires before family obligation. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very modern, very independent. I simply needed to adjust my expectations accordingly." The calm delivery made the words more devastating than if Margaret had shouted them. Emily felt tears building behind her eyes, a mixture of guilt and frustration, and something that might have been grief for the easy relationship they'd had before the heart attack changed everything. "I spent 5 days feeling guilty about being. They are calling you constantly, worrying." "You needn't have worried. As you can see, I managed perfectly well without you." The conversation was interrupted by David's arrival. Emily had never been so grateful to see her husband, though his expression as he assessed the tension in the room suggested he immediately understood that something had fundamentally shifted. "Margaret, you look wonderful," David said, leaning down to kiss her cheek with the careful affection of someone trying to navigate family politics. "Much better than when I left." "Thank you, David. I feel much better. More myself." Emily caught the emphasis on the last 2 words and wondered if her mother was suggesting she'd lost her self-independence, that Emily's care had somehow diminished her rather than helped her heal. Dr. Morrison's scheduled follow-up visit that afternoon provided a welcome distraction from the careful politeness that had replaced genuine conversation. Emily was grateful for his presence. His professional authority might cut through whatever emotional game her mother seemed to be playing. "Your recovery is remarkable, Margaret," Dr. Morrison said after completing his examination. "Your heart function has stabilized beautifully, and your energy levels seem much improved." "I feel like myself again," Margaret replied, and Emily caught her shooting a meaningful glance in her direction. "And how are things emotionally? Are you feeling supported? Positive about the future?" "Very positive. I've had time to think about what really matters, what I can count on. It's been clarifying." Dr. Morrison's expression grew more serious as he glanced between mother and daughter. "Emily, how do you feel about your mother's recovery?" I'm glad she's feeling stronger, though I'm concerned about the emotional distance I'm sensing." "What emotional distance?" Margaret asked with perfectly performed confusion. Dr. Morrison studied them both with the careful attention of someone who'd seen too many families fracture under medical stress. Sometimes cardiac events can trigger complex emotional responses: fear, resentment, changes in family dynamics. It's important to address these issues directly rather than letting them fester. "I'm not sure what you mean," Margaret said. "Emily and I are fine. She has her life in Boston. I have mine here. We're both adults with separate responsibilities." The words sounded reasonable, but Emily heard the finality in them, as if her mother was drawing new boundaries, redefining their relationship in terms of polite distance rather than intimate connection. Rose Patterson's visit later that afternoon only amplified the tension. She arrived with her usual confidence, settling into the kitchen as if she owned it, her sharp eyes immediately cataloging the strained atmosphere. "Emily, dear, you look tired. I suppose all that traveling takes its toll." "The wedding was wonderful," Emily replied carefully, unsure why she felt defensive. "I'm sure it was, though I can't help thinking how much more wonderful it would have been if you'd been celebrating your mother's recovery instead of gallivanting around Italy." Margaret said nothing, but her silence felt like agreement. Emily realized that her mother had probably discussed her absence with Rose, had perhaps received validation for her hurt feelings from someone who shared her traditional views about family duty. "Margaret seems to have done very well without constant supervision," Emily said, testing the waters. "Oh, she's always been remarkably self-sufficient," Rose agreed. Some people mistake independence for not needing love and support. Others understand that strength doesn't mean you don't want your family close during difficult times. The indirect criticism hit its mark. Emily felt herself growing defensive, angry at being made to feel guilty for attending her best friend's wedding, for having a life beyond caring for her mother. As evening approached and Emily prepared to return to Boston, she made one last attempt at honest conversation. She found Margaret in the garden, deadheading roses with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was avoiding rather than engaging. "Mom, I feel like something's broken between us, and I don't know how to fix it." Margaret continued her careful pruning. "Nothing's broken, Emily. I've simply accepted reality." "What reality?" "That you're an adult with your own priorities. That I can't rely on you the way I thought I could. That's not a criticism. It's just the truth." Emily felt tears spill over, frustration mixing with a grief she couldn't name. "I was there for you. For 2 weeks, I put my entire life on hold to take care of you, until something more interesting came along." The words hung between them like a blade. Emily realized that her mother had been counting, keeping score, building a case for abandonment based on one difficult choice. "It wasn't more interesting. It was important to someone I love." "Yes," Margaret said quietly, finally looking up from the roses. "I understand that now." When David came to collect Emily for the drive back to Boston, the goodbye felt different than any they'd shared before. Margaret hugged her daughter with the careful affection of someone handling fragile objects, and Emily found herself wondering if this was what losing a parent felt like. Not through death, but through the slow erosion of connection. "Call me when you get home," Margaret said, but the words felt obligatory rather than caring. As they drove away, Emily watched her mother's house disappear in the rearview mirror and wondered how 5 days away could have created such distance. How love could feel so much like loss when nobody had actually died. David was quiet until they reached the highway. "What happened while you were gone?" "I don't know," Emily said honestly. "I came back to a different person. Like she's decided something about me, about us, and I don't get to know what it is. Maybe she just needs time to process her feelings about the wedding. Maybe. Or maybe I really did damage something irreparable by choosing Sarah over her." Emily stared out the window at the passing landscape, feeling like she was traveling away from more than just her mother's house. She was leaving behind the easy relationship they'd had before the heart attack, before choices had to be made, and loyalty had to be measured, and love had become something that could be withdrawn like a privilege revoked. Behind them, Margaret stood at her living room window watching the taillights disappear, her hand resting over the heart that had nearly stopped beating. In her purse lay the business card for William Hayes, and in his office sat a document that would ensure Emily someday understood exactly what her choices had cost. The house settled around Margaret like a familiar embrace, and she found herself wondering if revenge would feel as satisfying as she'd imagined, or if some victories were too hollow to provide the comfort they promised. 3 months had passed since Emily's return from Italy, and winter had settled over Millbrook with the kind of bitter cold that made bones ache and forced people indoors to contemplate their choices. Margaret had fallen into a routine that felt both familiar and hollow. Morning walks when the weather permitted, afternoon visits with Rose, evenings spent reading in the chair that had become her fortress against the world's disappointments. The phone calls from Emily had increased in frequency, if not in warmth. Every few days, her daughter would call with the careful concern of someone tending to a relationship she couldn't quite understand but felt obligated to maintain. The conversations followed a predictable pattern. Emily asking about Margaret's health, Margaret providing polite updates, both women dancing around the fundamental shift that had occurred between them. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" Emily had asked during Tuesday's call, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying too hard. "Fine, sweetheart. Dr. Morrison says my recovery is progressing beautifully." "That's wonderful." And you're staying warm? This cold snap must be difficult. Rose brings soup nearly every day. The neighbors have been very thoughtful. The pause that followed felt loaded with things neither woman could say. Emily wanted to ask why her mother sounded so distant, why every conversation felt like talking to a polite stranger. Margaret wanted to ask if Emily ever thought about the choice she'd made, if she understood the weight of choosing celebration over comfort when it mattered most. "I was thinking of coming for a visit next weekend," Emily had offered tentatively. "Oh, that's not necessary. I know how busy you are with work. Don't disrupt your schedule for me." The words were gracious, but Emily heard the dismissal underneath. "It wouldn't be a disruption. I want to see you." "Of course, dear. Whatever you think is best." Margaret had hung up feeling the familiar mixture of satisfaction and emptiness that had become her constant companion. She was protecting herself, drawing boundaries, refusing to be hurt again by expectations that would inevitably be disappointed. But the protection felt like living behind glass, safe, but somehow removed from the warmth she'd once taken for granted. Rose Patterson had noticed the change in her friend, though she attributed it to the natural aftermath of a cardiac event. Depression was common among heart attack survivors, and Margaret's emotional distance seemed to fit that pattern. What Rose didn't expect was to stumble upon the truth during a routine visit to her own attorney's office. She'd gone to William Hayes to update her power of attorney documents, a task she'd been putting off since her own health scare the previous year. The appointment had run long, and she'd emerged from his office at the same time he was walking another client to the door. A routine encounter that would have been forgettable if not for the conversation she'd inadvertently overheard. "I still think you should reconsider," Hayes was saying to his departing client. "Family relationships are complicated, but permanent legal changes should be made with great care." "I've given it 3 months of careful consideration," came the reply, and Rose froze as she recognized Margaret's voice. "If anything, I'm more certain now than I was then." "Very well. The documents are properly executed and filed. But Margaret, I hope you'll think about the conversation we discussed, about communication and forgiveness." Rose ducked back into the waiting area, her mind racing as she processed what she'd heard. Legal changes involving family relationships, mentions of forgiveness and communication. The implications were troubling. By the time Margaret appeared in the waiting area, Rose had composed herself enough to greet her friend with carefully casual surprise. "Margaret, what a coincidence. I didn't know you had business with William." Margaret's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally resigned acceptance. "Just updating some paperwork. You know how it is after a medical event. Everything needs to be current." Rose nodded, but her concern deepened. Margaret was lying, or at least not telling the complete truth. In 40 years of friendship, Rose had learned to read the subtle signs of her friend's emotional state, and something about Margaret's careful composure felt forced. "Would you like to have coffee?" Rose asked. "I feel like we haven't had a proper conversation in weeks." They walked to their usual spot, Millbrook Coffee and Books, a combination cafe and bookstore that Margaret had helped establish during her library years. The familiar surroundings usually put both women at ease, but today Rose noticed how Margaret seemed to armor herself in politeness, deflecting personal questions with the skill of someone who'd had practice. "How are things with Emily?" Rose asked after they'd settled at their corner table. "Fine. She calls regularly, very dutiful." The word choice struck Rose as odd. Dutiful wasn't how a mother typically described a loving daughter's attention. "And how do you feel about her wedding trip now? With some time and distance?" Margaret's cup rattled slightly against the saucer as she set it down. "I've gained perspective on a lot of things lately." "What kind of perspective?" For a moment, Margaret's careful mask slipped, revealing something raw and wounded underneath. "The kind that comes from understanding where you really stand in people's priorities." Rose leaned forward, recognizing the opening she'd been waiting for. "Margaret, what did you do at William Hayes's office today?" The direct question caught Margaret off guard. Her friend's sharp eyes missed nothing, and Rose had clearly heard more than Margaret had hoped. I told you, paperwork. Don't lie to me. I heard William mention family relationships and forgiveness. What kind of paperwork involves those things? Margaret was quiet for so long that Rose thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I changed my will. Rose felt her stomach drop. Changed it how? Emily is no longer my beneficiary. Everything goes to the Literacy Foundation instead. The words hung between them like an accusation. Rose stared at her friend, seeing the pain and pride warring in Margaret's expression, understanding suddenly the depth of hurt that had driven such a drastic decision. Margaret, my God. You disinherited your own daughter? I made a decision, based on what I learned about her character. Rose's voice sharpened with disbelief. Her character? Margaret, she's your daughter. She loves you. Does she? Margaret's composure finally cracked, revealing the anguish she'd been carrying for months. Because when I was lying in that hospital bed, terrified I might die, all I could think about was how much I needed her with me. And when she chose a party over providing that comfort, I learned exactly what our relationship means to her. It wasn't a party. It was her best friend's wedding. It was a choice. Margaret's voice rose, drawing glances from other cafe patrons. She lowered it again, but the intensity remained. When it mattered most, when I was vulnerable and frightened and needed to feel loved, she chose celebration over comfort. That told me everything I needed to know. Rose studied her, friend's face, seeing the raw pain beneath the anger. Did you tell her how frightened you were? Did you ask her to stay? Margaret's silence was answer enough. You didn't, did you? You told her to go. You gave her permission, even encouraged her, and then you punished her for taking it. I shouldn't have had to ask. Love means knowing. It means choosing the people who matter most without having to be told. Rose shook her head, feeling a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Margaret, that's not fair, and you know it. Emily isn't a mind reader. If you needed her to stay but told her to go, how was she supposed to know what you really wanted? She should have wanted to stay. She should have felt the pull of family obligation, of love, of basic human decency. Or maybe she trusted you when you said you'd be fine. Maybe she believed you were strong enough to handle a few days alone because that's what you told her. Margaret felt tears building behind her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since making the decision to change her will. I needed her, Rose. I was so scared, and I needed my daughter with me, and she chose someone else instead. Rose reached across the table and took Margaret's hand, feeling the tremor of suppressed emotion. I know you were scared. I know you needed her. But punishing her for not reading your mind isn't the same as justice. What's done is done. No, it's not. Wills can be changed back. Relationships can be repaired. But only if you're willing to be honest about what you really want. Margaret pulled her hand away, retreating back into the careful distance she'd maintained for months. What I want is to protect myself from further disappointment. Emily has shown me who she is. I'm simply accepting that reality. What Emily showed you is that she's human, that she makes difficult choices based on incomplete information, that she trusted you enough to believe you when you said you'd be fine. The conversation was interrupted by Rose's phone buzzing with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her heart skip. It was from Emily. Speaking of Emily, Rose said carefully, she's been texting me. She's worried about you. Says you seem different since she got back from Italy, but she can't figure out what's wrong. Margaret's expression hardened. I'm sure she's very concerned. She is concerned. She calls you constantly, asks about visiting, tries to bridge. Whatever gap she senses has opened between you. That doesn't sound like someone who doesn't care. Guilt is a powerful motivator. Rose stared at her friend, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw that had appeared during their rare arguments over the years. Margaret, listen to yourself. You're rewriting history to justify a decision you made in pain and anger. Emily isn't guilty of anything except trusting you to be honest about your needs. She's guilty of choosing a wedding over her mother's recovery. She's guilty of being human, of making an impossible choice between two people she loves, of believing you when you told her to go and be happy. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the cafe floor. I think this conversation is over. Margaret, please. Think about what you're doing. You're destroying your relationship with your daughter over a misunderstanding that could be resolved with one honest conversation. Some things can't be resolved, Rose. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal. This wasn't a betrayal. This was a miscommunication between two people who love each other but don't know how to express their needs directly. But Margaret was already walking away, leaving Rose sitting alone at their corner table with the weight of a secret she wasn't sure she could carry. That evening, Rose sat in her own kitchen, staring at her phone and debating whether to call Emily. The weight of Margaret's secret felt crushing, but the implications of keeping it felt worse. She'd watched her friend spend 3 months nurturing resentment based on unspoken expectations, had seen how the isolation was hardening Margaret's heart into something unrecognizable. Meanwhile, 3 hours away in Boston, Emily was having her own moment of reckoning. She'd called her mother twice that week, and both times had felt like she was talking to a stranger. Polite, distant, carefully neutral. The woman who'd raised her, who'd been her closest confidant for most of her life, had become unreachable. She hates me, Emily told David over dinner, her voice thick with unshed tears. I can feel it in every conversation. She's polite, but it's the kind of politeness you show to people you don't want to deal with. David looked up from his plate, concern creasing his features. Maybe she's still processing the heart attack. Trauma can change people. It's more than that. It's like she's decided something about me, about us, and I don't get to know what it is or defend myself against it. Have you tried asking her directly? Emily laughed bitterly. I've tried everything. I call more often. I offer to visit. I ask how she's feeling, what she needs. She responds like I'm a duty she has to endure. What about the wedding? Do you think she's still upset about that? I don't know. Maybe. But David, I was there for her for 2 weeks. I put my entire life on hold to take care of her. And yes, I went to Sarah's wedding, but only for 5 days. 5 days out of a months-long recovery. David reached across the table and took her hand. Maybe you should go see her. Not call and ask permission, just go. Force the conversation you need to have. What if she doesn't want to see me? What if she does but doesn't know how to say it? Emily stared out their apartment window at the Boston skyline, feeling the pull of a relationship that had once been the most solid thing in her life. I keep thinking about Dad's last months, how Mom was with him every single day. She never left his side, never took a break, never chose anything over being there for him. Your father was dying. This is different. Is it? Or did I fail some test I didn't even know I was taking? David squeezed her hand, wishing he had answers that could ease the guilt he saw consuming his wife. You can't live your life trying to measure up to a standard nobody explained to you. If your mother needed you to stay but told you to go, that's on her communication, not your love. Emily wanted to believe that, but the doubt had taken root and was growing stronger with each stilted phone conversation, each polite dismissal of her offers to visit. Something fundamental had changed between them, and she was beginning to fear it might be permanent. Back in Millbrook, Margaret sat in her living room, staring at the business card for William Hayes that she'd placed on the coffee table. 3 months ago, changing her will had felt like taking control, like protecting herself from further disappointment. Tonight, it felt like something else, a decision made in pain that might have consequences she hadn't fully considered. Roses. Words echoed in her mind. Punishment isn't the same as justice. But what was justice when your only child chose celebration over comfort when you needed them most? What was fair when love felt conditional, measured in competing priorities? Margaret picked up her phone 3 times to call Emily, then set it down each time. What would she say? That she'd been wrong about feeling abandoned? That she'd overreacted to a choice any reasonable person might have made? That she'd let pride and hurt feelings drive her to legal revenge? Or was she right to protect herself? Was Emily's increased calling pattern just guilt? An attempt to ease her own conscience? Rather than genuine concern? Had her daughter learned anything from the choice she'd made? Or was she simply going through the motions of dutiful daughter behavior? The questions circled in Margaret's mind like water going down a drain, and she realized that 3 months of isolation had brought her no closer to answers, only deeper into a maze of hurt feelings and wounded pride. Pat Kelly's weekly visit the next day brought a perspective Margaret hadn't expected. After the routine vital signs check and medication review, Pat lingered in a way that suggested she had something on her mind. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem emotionally isolated in a way that concerns me." Margaret stiffened. "I'm managing very well, thank you. Physically, absolutely. Your recovery has been textbook. But emotional health is part of overall wellness, and I'm seeing signs that worry me." "What kind of signs?" Pat chose her words carefully. "You seem to have withdrawn from the relationships that were important to you before the heart attack. Your daughter calls constantly but never visits. You mention Rose less frequently. You're more guarded in our conversations." "I'm simply being more realistic about my expectations." "Or you're protecting yourself from vulnerability, which can be just as damaging as the original hurt." Margaret felt exposed under Pat's professional gaze. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean that isolation might feel safer than risking disappointment, but it's not healthier. The heart needs emotional connection to heal fully, not just medical intervention." "My heart is healing fine." "Your cardiac function is excellent, but hearts are more than muscle and circulation, Margaret. They're also the center of our emotional lives, and yours seems to be closing off." The observation hit closer to home than Margaret wanted to admit. She'd spent 3 months congratulating herself on her newfound clarity, her acceptance of reality, her refusal to be hurt again. But sitting in her living room each evening, surrounded by the silence she'd chosen, she sometimes wondered if clarity was just another word for loneliness. After Pat left, Margaret found herself standing at the window, watching the street where Emily's car had appeared so many times over the years, for holidays, for visits, for the simple pleasure of spending time together. The absence of those visits felt like a wound that wouldn't heal, even though Margaret herself had caused it. She thought about Rose's accusation that she was punishing Emily for not reading her mind. Was that what she'd done? Had she created an impossible test and then condemned her daughter for failing it? Or had Emily's choice revealed something fundamental about her character, something Margaret needed to accept and protect herself against? The questions had no easy answers, but Margaret realized that 3 months of certainty were beginning to crack around the edges. The decision that had felt so clear in the immediate aftermath of hurt was becoming more complicated as the sharp edge of pain dulled into something more complex. That night, she pulled out William Hay's business card again, staring at it as if it might provide the answers that had been eluding her. She could call him, schedule another appointment, reverse the will change. It would be simple from a legal standpoint, a matter of paperwork and signatures. But reversing the emotional damage felt more complicated. How do you undo 3 months of careful distance? How do you rebuild trust after letting pride poison love? How do you admit that the decision you'd been so certain about might have been wrong from the beginning? Margaret set the card back on the coffee table and went to bed with questions that had no answers, carrying the weight of a secret that was becoming heavier with each passing day. Somewhere in Boston, Emily was lying awake with her own questions about love and duty, and the mysterious way her mother had become a stranger. And in between them stretched the distance of unspoken truths, missed opportunities, and the stubborn pride that was keeping two people who loved each other from finding their way back to connection. The chest pain started during Margaret's morning. Coffee, a familiar tightness that made her pause mid-sip and press her palm against her breastbone. For a moment, she wondered if it was just anxiety, the physical manifestation of 3 months spent carrying the weight of secrets and unresolved hurt. But as the sensation intensified, radiating down her left arm with the unmistakable signature of cardiac distress, Margaret felt the cold rush of recognition. Not again. Not when she'd finally found her equilibrium, her protective distance, her careful control over a life that had been upended by vulnerability. Pat Kelly arrived for her weekly visit to find Margaret sitting rigidly in her kitchen chair, her face pale and drawn with the kind of controlled fear that comes from experience with medical crisis. "Margaret, what's happening?" "Chest pain," Margaret managed. "Started about 10 minutes ago. It's familiar." Pat's training kicked in immediately. Blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, questions delivered with calm efficiency while her mind calculated response times and treatment options. Margaret's blood pressure was elevated, her pulse irregular, her skin clammy with stress-induced perspiration. "I'm calling 911, Pat said, already reaching for her phone. "And then I'm calling Emily." "No," Margaret said quickly. "Don't call Emily, not yet. Let's see what the doctors say first." But Pat was already dialing, her professional judgment, overriding Margaret's wishes. "Emily needs to know. Whatever's happening between you two, she needs to know." The ambulance arrived within minutes, transforming Margaret's quiet morning into the controlled chaos of emergency response. As the paramedics worked, asking the same questions she'd answered 3 months ago, Margaret found herself thinking not about her own mortality, but about the phone call Pat was making in the kitchen. The words that would once again pull Emily away from her Boston life and back to Millbrook. This time felt different somehow. Not the crushing, unexpected blow of the first heart attack, but something more like reckoning. As if her body was forcing her to confront the emotional stress she'd been carrying like a stone in her chest. Emily was in a client meeting when her phone rang. The second time that morning she'd had to apologize and step out to answer calls from Millbrook. But when she saw Pat Kelly's number, her stomach dropped with the terrible recognition of crisis. "Pat? What's wrong?" "Emily, your mother's having another cardiac episode. We're in the ambulance now, heading to Millbrook General. She's stable, but..." Emily didn't wait to hear the rest. "I'm coming. I'm leaving right now." She burst back into the conference room, gathering her papers with shaking hands while her colleagues watched with concern. "Family emergency. I have to go." The drive from Boston felt different this time, not the shocked numbness of 3 months ago, but a fierce urgency that cut through every other consideration. Work could wait. Meetings could be rescheduled. Whatever careful distance she'd been maintaining from her mother's life suddenly felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. David's support came without question when she called from the car. "Go," he said simply. "Stay as long as you need to. I'll handle everything here." "What if she dies thinking I don't love her?" Emily asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "What if I've spent 3 months proving to her that work matters more than family?" "That's not what you've proven. Drive carefully, Em. She's going to be okay." But Emily wasn't sure okay was enough anymore. She'd spent 3 months trying to navigate her mother's emotional distance, accepting the polite coolness as the new normal in their relationship. Now, faced with the possibility of losing Margaret entirely, Emily realized how much energy she'd wasted on pride and confusion instead of fighting for connection. Margaret was conscious when Emily arrived at the emergency room, her color better than it had been during the first heart attack, but her expression guarded in a way that spoke of emotional as well as physical pain. "You came," Margaret said. and Emily heard surprise underneath the careful neutrality. Of course I came. Emily pulled a chair close to the hospital bed, the same position she'd occupied 3 months ago. How are you feeling? Foolish. The doctors think it was stress-induced. My heart function has actually improved since the last episode. Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, his familiar presence a comfort in the sterile environment. His examination was thorough, but revealed what the emergency room doctors had already determined. This wasn't another major cardiac event, but rather the physical manifestation of prolonged emotional stress. We'll keep you overnight for observation, he told Margaret, but your heart muscle shows no new damage. However, I'm concerned about the underlying cause of this episode. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with hospital air conditioning. What kind of underlying cause? Dr. Morrison glanced between mother and daughter, his expression serious. Chronic stress, emotional isolation, unresolved conflict. These can all trigger cardiac symptoms in someone with existing heart disease. The heart doesn't exist in isolation from our emotional lives. Margaret's eyes found the ceiling tiles, avoiding both her daughter's gaze and the implications of the doctor's words. Margaret, Dr. Morrison continued gently, when we spoke 3 months ago, I mentioned that family support was crucial for recovery. Not just physical support, but emotional connection. Isolation can be as damaging as any cardiac risk factor. I'm not isolated, Margaret protested weakly. You've withdrawn from the people who care about you most. That's a form of isolation, even if you're surrounded by neighbors and nurses. Emily felt tears building behind her eyes. Is this my fault? Did I cause this by going to the wedding? Dr. Morrison's expression softened. Emily, cardiac health is complex, but unresolved family conflict creates chronic stress that can absolutely impact recovery. The question isn't about fault. It's about how to move forward in a way that supports everyone's well-being. He asked to speak with each woman separately, starting with Margaret. When they were alone, his professional demeanor gave way to something more direct. Margaret, I've been treating you for 3 months, and I've watched you isolate yourself from the people who love you. You're punishing yourself as much as you're punishing Emily. I'm protecting myself. From what? From the possibility that love might require forgiveness? From the chance that your daughter's choice came from a place of trust rather than selfishness? Margaret turned away, but Dr. Morrison pressed on. Your daughter has called this hospital every week since your first heart attack, asking about your recovery, requesting updates. She's visited 3 times, only to be met with polite distance. Today, she dropped everything to be here. Does that sound like someone who doesn't care? When he spoke with Emily privately, Dr. Morrison's message was equally direct. Your mother is carrying emotional pain that's manifesting as physical symptoms. I can treat the cardiac effects, but I can't heal whatever rift exists between you. I don't know how to fix it, Emily admitted. She's been different since I got back from Italy. Distant. Like she's decided something about me, but won't tell me what it is. Have you asked her directly? I've tried, but she deflects. Says everything's fine, that she understands my priorities. And what are your priorities, Emily? The question caught her off guard. My family, my mother. I know I made a difficult choice with the wedding, but you thought she was strong enough to handle your absence because that's what she told you. Emily nodded, tears spilling over. I trusted her when she said she'd be fine. I believed she meant it when she told me to go. Maybe it's time to have that conversation again, but more honestly this time. Your mother needs to understand that her indirect communication style creates impossible situations, and you need to understand that her need for emotional support isn't the same as being weak or manipulative. Rose Patterson arrived that evening, bringing the particular energy of someone who'd been waiting for an opportunity to address difficult truths. She hugged Emily warmly, then studied Margaret with the sharp attention of someone cataloging emotional as well as physical symptoms. "How are you feeling, dear?" she asked Margaret. "Better. The doctors say it wasn't a major episode." "Good. Though I have to say I'm not surprised. The stress you've been carrying would affect anyone's health." Emily looked up sharply. "What? Stress?" Rose glanced between mother and daughter, recognizing the moment she'd been waiting for. The stress of keeping secrets, of nurturing hurt feelings instead of addressing them directly, of making legal decisions based on wounded pride. Margaret's face went white. "Rose, no, Margaret. This has gone on long enough. Emily deserves to know what you've done. And you deserve the chance to undo it before it's too late." Emily felt the familiar chill of sensing important information just beyond her reach. "Know what? What legal decisions?" Rose looked at Margaret with the firmness of someone who'd decided that friendship sometimes required difficult truths. "Tell her, Margaret, or I will." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 months of secrecy pressing against her chest like another kind of heart attack. When she opened them, Emily was watching her with the intense attention of someone bracing for revelation. "I changed my will," Margaret said quietly. "After you went to Italy, I disinherited you." The words hung in the hospital room like a diagnosis, stark and unforgiving. Emily felt the bottom drop out of her world, not because of the inheritance, but because of what the action revealed about her mother's pain, her anger, her fundamental judgment of Emily's character. "You what?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "I left everything to the Literacy Foundation instead. I believed it was the right thing to do." Emily stared at her mother, seeing past the polite distance to the wounded woman underneath. "Because I went to Sarah's wedding. Because you chose celebration over family when it mattered most." The hospital room fell, silent except for the mechanical beeping of monitoring equipment. Emily felt pieces of the past 3 months clicking into place. Her mother's coolness, the careful distance, the sense that Margaret had decided something irreversible about their relationship. "Mom," Emily said finally, "I went to that wedding because you told me to go. Because you insisted you'd be fine. Because I trusted you to be honest about what you needed." Margaret's composure finally cracked, 3 months of carefully maintained, control dissolving into the tears she'd been holding back. "I needed you," she whispered. "I was so scared. And I needed my daughter with me. And you chose someone else instead." Emily reached for her mother's hand, understanding finally the depth of miscommunication that had driven them apart. "I chose wrong," she said. "Not because I went to the wedding, but because I didn't fight harder to understand what you really needed. I should have seen past your brave face to the fear underneath." Margaret looked at their joined hands, feeling something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with cardiac distress. "I should have been honest about my fear instead of testing whether you'd choose me without being asked." The conversation that followed wasn't easy. 3 months of hurt feelings, wounded pride, and unspoken expectations couldn't be resolved in a single hospital room discussion. But as Emily refused to leave her mother's bedside that night, as Margaret slowly let down the emotional walls she'd built to protect herself, both women began to understand that love didn't require perfect choices, only the willingness to keep choosing each other despite mistakes. Dr. Morrison, checking on Margaret later that evening, found mother and daughter talking quietly, their heads bent together in a way that reminded him why family support was the most powerful medicine he could prescribe. The will change could be reversed, the hurt feelings could be healed. But first, they had to do the harder work of learning to communicate honestly about love, need, fear, and the complicated ways that families choose each other again and again, despite their failures. Margaret had been home for 3 days when Rose Patterson appeared at her door with the determined expression of someone who'd made an irreversible decision. She carried a covered casserole, and the particular energy that came from friendship pushed to its breaking point. "We need to talk," Rose announced, setting the dish on Margaret's kitchen counter with more force than necessary. "All of us. I've..." called Emily. Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Rose, what did you do?" "What I should have done weeks ago. Emily's driving up from Boston this afternoon, and the three of us are going to have the conversation you've been avoiding since October." "I don't think that's necessary." "Margaret Whitmore, don't you dare try to manage this situation. You've spent 4 months nursing wounded feelings instead of addressing them directly. Emily's spent 4 months walking on eggshells, trying to repair damage she doesn't even understand. And I've spent weeks carrying the weight of your secret because you're too proud to clean up your own mess." The sharp tone caught Margaret off guard. In 40 years of friendship, Rose had been supportive, understanding, occasionally critical, but never this direct in her anger. "You don't understand the complexity of the situation. I understand that you disinherited your daughter because she trusted you when you said you'd be fine. I understand that you've let pride poison the most important relationship in your life. And I understand that if you keep going down this path, you'll lose Emily permanently. Not because she stops loving you, but because she stops trying to connect with someone who won't let her in." Margaret sank into her kitchen chair, feeling the weight of Rose's words. "What if I can't forgive her choice? What if every time I look at her, I think about lying in that hospital bed wondering if my own daughter cared whether I lived or died?" Then you tell her that. You have the conversation like adults instead of making legal decisions designed to hurt someone who doesn't even know what she's being punished for. Emily arrived 2 hours later, her expression cautious but determined. She hugged her mother, carefully, the way she'd learned to navigate the fragile emotional landscape between them, then turned to Rose with questioning eyes. "Rose said you wanted to talk to both of us. About what?" Rose looked between mother and daughter, seeing the careful distance they maintained even in the same room, the way they seemed to be performing normalcy rather than living it. "About the fact that you've both been lying to each other for months. About unspoken expectations and unaddressed hurt feelings. About the will change that Margaret made after you went to Sarah's wedding." Emily turned to her mother, confusion clouding her features. "Will change? Mom? What is she talking about?" Margaret felt exposed under her daughter's gaze. The secret she'd carried like armor suddenly feeling like a burden too heavy to bear. "I told you in the hospital. I changed my will after Italy. You're no longer my beneficiary." "I know that part. But Rose makes it sound like..." Emily's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "You did it to punish me. For going to the wedding. I did it to protect myself from future disappointment." Emily stared at her mother, seeing past the careful words to the pain underneath. "You were so hurt by my choice that you decided to write me out of your life entirely. I decided to be realistic about where I stand in your priorities." Rose intervened before the conversation could spiral into another round of careful distance and wounded feelings. "Stop. Both of you. Stop talking around the truth and start talking about it directly." She pulled out a chair and sat down with the authority of someone who'd decided that friendship sometimes required brutal honesty. "Margaret, you tell Emily exactly how you felt when she left for Italy. Not the sanitized version, not the I understand your decision version. Tell her the truth." Margaret's hands trembled as she looked at her daughter. "I felt abandoned. I was terrified of having another heart attack alone, terrified of dying alone. And my only child chose to be 5,000 miles away at a party." "It wasn't a party. Let her finish," Rose said firmly. Margaret continued, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam. "I kept thinking about your father's death, how I never left his side, how family duty meant everything to me. And then when I needed that same devotion, you chose someone else's happiness over my comfort. Emily felt tears building, but Rose gestured for her to wait. Now, Emily, you tell Margaret exactly why you made the choice you did. Not the defensive version, the honest version. Emily took a shaky breath. I went because you told me to go. Because you insisted you'd be fine. That you didn't need me hovering. Because Sarah was my closest friend, and I'd promised to be her maid of honor. But mostly, I went because I believed you when you said you wanted me to be happy. Even though you could see I was scared? I thought you were being brave. I thought you were recovering well, and that a few days away wouldn't matter. I trusted Pat Kelly to take care of your medical needs, and I trusted you to be honest about your emotional needs. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I couldn't ask you to stay. Asking would have felt like admitting how dependent I'd become, how frightened I was. So, instead, you tested whether I'd choose you without being asked. Yes. Emily leaned back in her chair, the truth settling over her like a weight. And when I failed your test, you decided I didn't love you enough. I decided you loved yourself more. Rose watched the exchange with the careful attention of someone refereeing an emotional boxing match.
Do you hear yourselves? Margaret, you created an impossible situation and then blamed Emily for not reading your mind. Emily, you assumed your mother's brave face was the whole truth instead of looking deeper. I should have looked deeper,
Emily admitted. I should have seen past your words to what you really needed. And I should have been honest about my fear instead of expecting you to intuit it, Margaret replied. Rose nodded approvingly. Good. Now we're getting somewhere. Margaret, do you still believe Emily chose the wedding because she doesn't love you? Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked at her, seeing the woman who'd dropped everything to rush to the hospital, who'd spent months calling and visiting despite being met with polite distance, who was sitting here now fighting for a relationship Margaret had tried to end with legal paperwork. No, she said quietly. I think she made the best decision she could with the information I gave her. And Emily, do you understand why your mother felt abandoned, even if that wasn't your intention? Emily nodded. She needed to feel chosen. She needed to know that when everything felt uncertain, I would prioritize being with her over everything else. Even if she told you not to? Especially then. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, 4 months of carefully maintained anger dissolving into something more vulnerable. I was wrong to change my will. I was wrong to punish you for trusting me. And I was wrong to take your brave face at face value when I should have understood the fear underneath. Rose reached for both their hands, linking them together across the kitchen table. You're both wrong and you're both right. That's what happens in families. You love each other imperfectly, and then you figure out how to forgive the imperfections. Emily squeezed her mother's hand. I want to understand what you need from me going forward. But I also need you to understand that I can't always anticipate needs you don't express directly. I need to feel like I matter to you, like when you're making important decisions. My well-being is part of the equation. It is part of the equation. It always has been. But I also need the freedom to make choices that you might not agree with, without feeling like I'm being tested for the adequacy of my love. Margaret nodded slowly. That's fair. More than fair. Rose smiled for the first time since arriving. Good. Now, Margaret, what are you going to do about the will? I'm calling William Hayes tomorrow. I want to reverse the change. Are you sure? Not because of guilt or pressure, but because it's what you really want? Margaret looked at her daughter, seeing past 4 months of hurt feelings to the woman who'd raised, loved, and yes, sometimes disappointed her, but who'd never stopped, trying to maintain their connection despite every obstacle Margaret had placed in her path. I'm sure. The Literacy Foundation is important, but Emily is my daughter. My legacy isn't just money. It's the relationship we build from here forward. Emily felt tears spilling over, relief mixing with a grief for the time they'd lost to, miscommunication and wounded pride. "Mom, I love you. I've never stopped loving you, even when I couldn't understand why you'd become so distant. I love you too, sweetheart. I'm sorry I made you guess at what I needed instead of being brave enough to ask for it directly." Rose released their hands and sat back, satisfaction evident in her expression. There. Was that so difficult? Both women laughed through their tears, recognizing the truth in Rose's sarcasm. It had been difficult, perhaps the hardest conversation either had ever had, but it had also been necessary, cleansing, and ultimately healing. The work of rebuilding trust would take time. The patterns of communication that had led to this crisis would need to be changed. But sitting in Margaret's kitchen, holding hands across the table where they'd shared countless meals and conversations over the years, both women felt something they hadn't experienced in months: hope that love could indeed overcome hurt, that families could learn from their failures, and that some relationships were worth fighting for, even when the fighting was messy, painful, and imperfect. Outside, the February afternoon was giving way to evening, but inside Margaret's house, something that had been broken was slowly beginning to heal. 6 months after the confrontation in Margaret's kitchen, the annual Millbrook Library fundraiser bloomed with the particular energy that comes from community celebration mixed with personal triumph. Margaret stood behind the book display table, her color robust and her smile genuine as she discussed first edition donations with potential buyers. Emily worked beside her, arranging floral centerpieces with the easy collaboration that had taken months to rebuild. "The Dickens collection is going for twice what we expected," Emily observed, watching a bidding war develop over the leather-bound volumes that had scattered across the library floor during Margaret's first heart attack. "Robert would be pleased," Margaret replied. "He always said books were investments in the future." The ease between them was hard-won, built on a foundation of weekly phone calls where both women practiced expressing needs directly, monthly visits that happened without guilt or obligation, and the careful trust that comes from learning to communicate honestly about love, fear, and the complex mathematics of family loyalty. Margaret had kept her word about the will. Attorney. Hayes had drafted new documents that divided her estate between Emily and the Millbrook Literacy Foundation, a decision that felt like honoring both family and legacy rather than choosing between them. "Mrs. Whitmore, you look wonderful," Dr. Morrison said, appearing at their booth with the satisfied expression of a physician whose patient had healed beyond medical intervention. "How are you feeling?" "Strong," Margaret answered, and Emily heard the truth in it. "Terrified of having another heart attack alone, terrified of dying alone, and my only child chose to be 5,000 miles away at a party." "It wasn't a party." "Let her finish," Rose said firmly. Margaret continued, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam. "I kept thinking about your father's death, how I never left his side, how family duty meant everything to me. And then when I needed that same devotion, you chose someone else's happiness over my comfort." Emily felt tears building, but Rose gestured for her to wait. "Now, Emily, you tell Margaret exactly why you made the choice you did. Not the defensive version, the honest version." Emily took a shaky breath. "I went because you told me to go. Because you insisted you'd be fine, that you didn't need me hovering. Because Sarah was my closest friend, and I'd promised to be her maid of honor. But mostly, I went because I believed you when you said you wanted me to be happy. Even though you could see I was scared, I thought you were being brave. I thought you were recovering well and that a few days away wouldn't matter. I trusted Pat Kelly to take care of your medical needs, and I trusted you to be honest about your emotional needs." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I couldn't ask you to stay. Asking would have felt like admitting how dependent I'd become, how frightened I was. So instead, you tested whether I'd choose you without being asked." "Yes." Emily leaned. back in her chair, the truth settling over her like a weight. And when I failed your test, you decided I didn't love you enough. I decided you loved yourself more. Rose watched the exchange with the careful attention of someone refereeing an emotional boxing match. Do you hear yourselves? Margaret, you created an impossible situation and then blamed Emily for not reading your mind. Emily, you assumed your mother's brave face was the whole truth instead of looking deeper. I should have looked deeper, Emily admitted. I should have seen past your words to what you really needed. And I should have been honest about my fear instead of expecting you to intuit it, Margaret replied. Rose nodded approvingly. Good. Now we're getting somewhere. Margaret, do you still believe Emily chose the wedding because she doesn't love you? Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked at her, seeing the woman who'd dropped everything to rush to the hospital, who'd spent months calling and visiting despite being met with polite distance, who was sitting here now fighting for a relationship Margaret had tried to end with legal paperwork. No, she said quietly. I think she made the best decision she could with the information I gave her. And Emily, do you understand why your mother felt abandoned, even if that wasn't your intention? Emily nodded. She needed to feel chosen, purposeful, like myself again. The doctor's follow-up examination had shown remarkable improvement, not just in cardiac function, but in overall wellness. Margaret's blood pressure had stabilized, her energy levels had returned to pre-heart attack baseline, and most importantly, her emotional state reflected someone who'd found her way back to connection and meaning. Pat Kelly had become a regular visitor rather than a medical necessity, joining Margaret for coffee and conversation as a friend rather than a healthcare provider. Rose Patterson basked in the satisfaction of someone whose intervention had saved a relationship, though she was careful not to take too much credit for the hard work Margaret and Emily had done to rebuild trust. Emily's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Big news. Call me when you can. The timing felt significant. Exactly. The kind of moment that might have created tension 6 months ago. Now Emily showed the message to her mother without anxiety. Take it, Margaret said, gesturing toward the quiet corner of the library. I can handle the booth for a few minutes. Sarah's voice bubbled with excitement. Em, I'm pregnant, and Tom and I want to ask, would you be the baby's godmother? Emily felt the familiar pull of friendship mixed with something new, awareness of how her choices affected not just herself, but the relationships she'd worked so hard to repair. Sarah, that's wonderful news. I'm honored you'd ask me. So, you'll do it? I know it's a big responsibility, but let me talk to David and my mom, and I'll call you back tonight. But Sarah, I'm so happy for you. When Emily returned to the booth, Margaret studied her daughter's expression with the careful attention she'd learned to apply to emotional subtleties. Good news? Margaret asked. Sarah's pregnant. She wants me to be the baby's godmother. Margaret felt the old tightness in her chest. Not cardiac this time, but the emotional echo of competing loyalties. Then she remembered the conversation. In her kitchen, the commitment to honest communication, the understanding that love didn't require choosing sides. That's wonderful, Margaret said, and meant it. What an honor. And what perfect timing. I've been thinking about taking that trip to Boston you keep suggesting. I could help with godmother duties when the baby comes. Emily's smile was radiant, with relief and gratitude. You'd want to do that? I'd love to do that. Sarah's important to you, which makes her important to me. Besides, I think I'd enjoy being a surrogate grandmother. As the fundraiser wound down and evening settled over Millbrook, Emily and Margaret walked home together through streets where Margaret had built a life and Emily had learned to balance independence with connection. Their relationship would continue to evolve, require ongoing attention, face new challenges and opportunities for growth. But walking side by side in the September twilight, both women carried the hard-won knowledge that love could survive misunderstanding, that families could learn from their failures, and that some relationships were worth fighting for. Not because they were easy, but because they were irreplaceable. The work of family love was indeed continuous, but as Margaret slipped her arm through Emily's and felt the easy warmth of connection restored, she understood that the work itself was the reward, the daily choice to keep choosing each other despite imperfections, the commitment to building something stronger from the pieces of what had been broken. Above them, the first stars appeared in the New England sky, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the passing of another day, in a life made richer by love that had learned to speak its needs honestly and forgive its failures completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.